So we're now turning to the root text of the second chapter, and so following the order of those epithets, the first one is the discussion of the main thesis, which is that the Buddha is a true authority. Samadurva. He is the term is literally means the one who became a spiritual authority. So then this topic will be the first one, and when the explanation of the meaning of the term as it is understood from the Buddhist perspective, once that has been covered, then it starts saying that the Buddha is the one who cultivated compassion over a long period of time, and then that's the beginning of the discussion of the second epithet, which is that the Buddha is the one who is desirous of helping the world. So, and where we're starting is the first topic. In addition to describing what it means to call the Buddha a spiritual authority, in connection with that, a general description of what this school understands the meaning of correct cognition to be, which is the basic meaning of the word pramana. What are the qualities of the mind which enable it to be considered something that is a valid cognition as in general? And then, having explained that, then it says the Buddha is the one who possesses those characteristics in an extraordinary way. So we're, if you have the translation in English of Gyumed's commentary, we're actually reading from that text. The outline begins, the Tibetan commentaries typically put a lot of importance on the outline as a way of identifying the significance of each point in the subject matter. So the first one is then discussing the general characteristics of valid cognition. So then that topic is the first one. The second one is that the Buddha possesses the characteristics that are defining attributes of the valid cognition. So then covering the first one, the general characteristics, what we're trying to address first. So what is this? How does this school understand the meaning of valid cognition? So then that topic also has two divisions to it. One is the essential nature of the defining attribute, and then some characteristic, some additional characteristic that relates to that definition. So then again, breaking those two divisions down, the essential nature of the defining characteristic has three topics to it. One is what that defining characteristic itself is. Then what is a Densenshi means an example, right? An instance of a mind that possesses that defining attribute. And then third point is that instance that is being addressed establishes or determines the nature of that defining attribute. This is following the wording of the outline. So now we're talking about the first one of those. The first of those three latter topics is then what is the defining attribute of valid cognition? So then that also has 3 points to it. So the first one is identifying that defining attribute in terms of the term in Tibetan, which is translating Sanskrit term into Tibetan as milua. Milua in Tibetan usually means something that does not deceive or something that does not lead you astray, something like that. The actual Sanskrit term is more literally, it's a double negative. It is that which is not, that which is not in disagreement with something. So not in disagreement. So disagreement and then a negative to it, not in disagreement with the nature of reality. So that's more literal translation of the original term that Tibetans rendered as non-deceptive. Non-deceptive in the sense that it is not in disagreement with the way things are. So then the Rinpoche added that main attribute, which is, so the first verse, the first line of the first verse says that valid cognition is those forms of awareness that are not non-deceptive. And non-deceptive awareness is the main defining attribute of valid cognition. Then Rinpoche said that actually that is not the complete definition, or that's not the complete defining attribute. So there are 2 elements to the complete definition of valid cognition in this school, which adds the characteristic or the attribute of being non-deceiving initial, or the first, or the independent cognition, non-deceptive awareness of its object. Is a more complete definition of valid cognition. So sardu milua means newly, for the first time. The initial or the first non-deceptive awareness of some object is the more complete definition of what valid cognition is. So that's a point that needs to be addressed. And then another one is that then there are sort of counter views which say, well, that's not, that doesn't cover all instances of valid cognition. That's one counter position, and that's the Machava. Machava means it doesn't. So it's saying that definition maybe covers certain kinds of valid cognition, but not all forms of valid cognition. So that's one sort of objection or issue that's raised. The second one is that defining attribute goes too far, to saying that the notion of being a non-deceptive cognition can cover forms of awareness that do not properly qualify as valid cognition. So those 2 objections in relation to the main defining attribute of being non-deceptive. So the text will give the main defining attribute, and then it will address those 2 possible criticisms. So that's going to be outlined.
적응이 들어서 맞춰봤어요. 참아 강강하게 진입이 적응이 들어서.
올라서. 그래서 자를 좋은데 양체만에
전화에 내가
밀로에
적응이 들어서 어디지? 어디 나한테 더 집이지.
Okay. So we've already presented the idea that the main attribute of a valid cognition is a non-deceptive awareness, to use Tibetan translation. So then the commentary says, well, what does that mean to be a non-deceptive awareness? And so the commentary explains that should be understood to mean to, the wording literally says, to sort of gain possession of an object, cognitively gain that possession in the sense of knowledge of an object. That's what the meaning of non-deceptive, that's how non-deceptive should be understood. Then, so the second point was saying, well, that doesn't cover every kind of awareness that we want to call a valid cognition, because there are certain kinds of valid cognition that arise on the basis of speech, on the basis of words. So when we're reflecting on the meanings of words, we can gain some kind of awareness that we want to call a valid cognition, but that valid cognition doesn't consist of gaining cognitive possession of some kind of object. So therefore, that defining attribute is doesn't cover this particular type of mind, which is not non-deceptive in the way that word was described. So then, in the root text, in the first verse, I don't know if you all have. I think everyone was given a handout of the English. So it says, I'm not sure. So the third line of the verse says, that which arises from sound or speech is also, and then also is understood to mean also a form of valid cognition, even though it does not possess that quality of being a so-called non-deceptive awareness in the sense of cognizing some object. So that's meant, that line is meant to answer that objection that the definition or defining attribute doesn't cover every form of valid cognition. That's the part of the verse that addresses the first or criticism or objection against that definition.
That capture the thought, one thing to need that's what one thing to need says.
I did Javanam well.
The
Super.
says,
可是这些像我们比如第二章这个早上
one thing to need
是对这完全就不能So far we've only talked about the first verse, and then skipping the second verse. Not that we're not going to talk about the second verse, but skipping the second verse for the moment to identify the part of the root text that addresses the second objection, the second criticism. We've got to go to verse 3. The first line of the verse 3 says that minder. So that is saying that because a conventional mind, Gunzo is a conventional mind. So we'll get to how it's understood to be a conventional mind, what it's referring to. That conventional mind, because the conventional mind grasps is the apprehension of something that was already grasped. So So that is addressing the point of the newly non-deceptive mind. So this conventional mind is not newly non-deceptive. It's grasping something that was previously grasped. So therefore, that conventional mind, even though it's non-deceptive, it's not newly non-deceptive, and therefore the conventional mind is not accepted, according to Dharmakirti and Dignaga in this school, as a form of valid cognition, and therefore that defining attribute, taking into account that second quality of being newly non-deceptive, excludes conventional minds. And so that definition does not overextend and include things that are not actually forms of valid cognition. Okay, so that's the first part of this verse 3 is addressing that second objection. So this is the root text. We haven't actually explained it, but anyway, just identifying the words. So, and now in connection with this overall discussion, you have to understand the point of view of particular Buddhist schools. So this text was identified yesterday as principally being a text of the Chittamatra school. But the principles, the basic principles of epistemology and theory of knowledge that were formulated by this school were accepted by other schools, later schools, including, for example, the non-Prasangika form of the Madhyamika school. So the later form of the Madhyamika school, which is called, in Tibetan, is called the Svatrantrika Madhyamika school. So the school of the middle way doctrine or system that says you have to use an independent syllogism to prove the object to be established. That part of the middle way school, plus all the other lower schools, so meaning the Chittamatra school and the Svatrantrika school, those schools also hold to the same basic definition of valid cognition as being, in the Tibetan phrase, sadhu milue rikpa. So rikpa is the general term for any mind. So any mind which is a newly non-deceptive awareness, then that is the defining characteristic of valid cognition. So that newly non-deceptive will be addressed and is then essential for that range of Buddhist schools. And as we just pointed out, what it excludes, that one form of that conventional mind is recollection. So when you gain some realization, and then after you gain that realization, you recall it at a later time, then that is described as, literally in Tibetan, the term, it's a form of a cognitive state of mind that's called jeshu. Jeshu means a kind of discriminative awareness, which is typically translated by Westerners as recognition, meaning that it is the subsequent cognition of something that was cognized previously. So the fact that it was cognized subsequently means it's not that newly non-deceptive cognition. And so that form of recollection of something that you understood, even though it's valid, it's not the original cognition. So it's the original cognition that is the true form of valid cognition. Having said that, Prasangika school needs to be understood has a different point of view, and that is they do not require the definition of valid cognition to include that original or new cognition of some import. So for the Prasangikas, recollection or this discriminative awareness, this recognition or subsequent cognition, is a form of valid cognition according to the Prasangikas, but not any other of the Buddhist schools.
That is, Tanamseti Tenet, that is not preparatory Chibuda, or the much. Tambola, number to a time, Tatan Jibba Shedder Kobani, Samala Ralia, Dita be Gil Marubala, Kobani, Yaki Samayina, Tangi Kanda, Samaki, Samachi, Tingi, Ashina. That number to a time, Yeba, Tatan Jebba Kobani, that Samala Ralia is. Dita be you Marubala, Kobani. Dita you Marubala, and the Samaris. Samayina, Samati, Kanda, Samaki, Samati, Timid, Kashinas,
So then, now reading word for word from Gyetsokje's commentary, starts the first part of the discussion, which is identifying non-deceptiveness, the meaning of non-deceptiveness as the most important aspect of valid cognition. So it starts out, and so what this introductory phrase does is it makes a connection between the general meaning of valid cognition and how we incorporate that into the assertion that Buddha is the ultimate spiritual authority in the sense that he possesses valid cognition in its highest form. So it says here, the two main goals of Buddhism are the temporary goal of higher rebirth and the ultimate goal of liberation and Buddhahood, together with the means of attaining those goals, the realization of that subject matter, in order to attain a realization of that object or that import, it's necessary for us to gain that realization. We must resort to valid cognition. Valid cognition is what enables us to gain that proper understanding. And it says, so that's the basic meaning of valid cognition is important in a spiritual sense. And it says, the only individual or the only being that possesses that form of valid cognition about that subject matter in its entirety is the Muni, the Mahamuni, the Buddha Shakyamuni. So if that is the claim that's being made in relation to that first attribute, so when we assert that Buddha is that kind of spiritual authority, that he possesses valid cognition, most complete and highest sense, and he is unique in that respect, then what is the general defining attribute of valid cognition that underlies that claim? So that's kind of introduction to the subject.
That is it. Kita you malu pada tuanya sama. Tapi sama ini sebenarnya itu sama di kegiatan Jampa sebenarnya sama di Jampa itu. Dan sama ini sama di sini kerana sana. Sini kerana juga sama itu sini. Sini di kerana sini sama cuci. Sama ini. Satu dua maybe siapa yang baca, satu ini siapa itu sini satu. Lalu tadi tinggi pada, ani mungkin sama tiga. Lalu, sama ini jadi satu dua maybe siapa yang baca, tas, jenis tas ini jenis
Yes.
Tama yimbe kite karede na. Ane tabu midwe fa yimbe che.
Yes.
Jala tas intensi.
Yes.
Ala ni chi tin share.
Yes.
Yimbe kite karede se. Yimbe ta.
Yes.
Ta karede se. Ta.
Yes.
Tin tas.
Yes. Okay, so then in response to that question, so what is the general attribute, the defining attribute of valid cognition? If you ask that question, so that's sort of setting up the first statement, which is presented in the commentary in the form of a formal argument. And this formal argument is explaining the first line of the first verse, which says, valid cognition is awareness that is non-deceptive. That's all the root text says. Now, Gets Up J uses that wording to formulate an argument which is meant to present the defining attribute of valid cognition. So the Tibetan argument starts with a subject. And so this is called churjit in Tibetan. So it means that something that possesses the quality that we're trying to prove or determine. And that subject in this case is the direct perception of the color blue. So that direct perception of the color blue is the instance of a form of valid cognition. So it says, Wenjin Wensum Tema. Wensum Tema means one kind of valid cognition is direct perception. So the valid cognition, which is a direct perception of the color blue, that subject is a valid cognition. Okay, is a valid cognition is then the predicate of the thesis, right? The thesis is the direct perception of the color blue is a form of valid cognition. So a form of valid cognition is the predicate of that thesis. And then to prove that thesis, then you state the reason. In Tibetan, the typical word for reason is called dak. Dak literally means sign or mark. And I think the Sanskrit word is that's a synonym for reason. Another term is gyumed. Gyumed is the more typical word for reason. So that's a formal argument. You have a subject matter, you have the predicate of the thesis that is asserted about that subject matter, and then you state the reason why that's true. So here, the argument is, take the direct perception of the color blue as a subject. It is a form of valid cognition because, then it says, Sardu milua jingisheva yubechu. So in the root text, it just says, milua jingisheva. It says, in non-deceptive form of awareness. Then Gets Up J and adds to that to give the complete reason, because that direct perception of blue is an original or a new cognition that is non-deceptive. Right? So that's the formal argument. So then now we have, having presented that formal argument for what the definition of a valid cognition is, then we have sort of the hypothetical objection, which is used to as a method of exposition. And here in this case, the objection is is to say, well, your definition describes valid cognition as a mental entity, and yet you are the author of, in the case of Pramanavarttika and other scholars, you are the author of this lengthy treatise on the subject of valid cognition. So if we understand the nature of the mind, then it's not necessary to have a written treatise which tells us about the nature of valid cognition. And so that's the objection. And the reason for making that objection is then an element of epistemological theory which is kind of technical and only applies to certain Buddhist schools. There's something called Rangrik in Tibet. Rangrik is self-awareness, or awareness, the mind's awareness of itself. And this is a hypothetical entity which other schools claim or assert doesn't even exist, but in this school it is accepted and it's considered important for a wide range of meanings. So in this objection, it says that form of self-awareness of one's own mind, that self-awareness of one's own mind accompanies that direct perception of blue. So when we have direct perception of blue, there's another element of the mind which perceives the perception of blue. And that's the self-awareness, the Swasamvedana or Rangrik. And that self-awareness that accompanies the direct perception of the object blue, that's enough to establish the nature of that direct perception as a mind. And so, therefore, that alone is from our own experience. We can determine what non-deceptive cognition is, and we don't need epistemological treatises to tell us what valid cognition is. So that's kind of the objection. So the point is, well, why do we need treatises on valid cognition? And this is an objection which is being proposed to introduce the opportunity to answer that question. So let's talk about this hypothetical element of the mind that is being referred to here as self-awareness or Rangrik. So first of all, it's a form of awareness that is asserted certainly by this school, by the Chittamatra school, and it is also asserted or accepted by certain, not all forms of the Sautrantika school, which is a realist school. By realist, I mean one that accepts the existence of a real external world or physical matter. So one part of the Sautrantika school does accept this entity, meaning an element of the mind that perceives itself. And the Chittamatra school does. Then among the Madhyamika schools, in the middle way schools, the Prasangikas in particular, they reject that there is such a thing as self-awareness. So just to interject, one of the reasons for explaining or asserting the existence of this is it's a way that it's a theoretical entity that's used to explain the nature of recollection. So just put that in the back of your mind, and that has some relevance to this subject. Then the definition of self-awareness is it's a form of mind, kanan konala choshi, means it's an introspective state of mind. It's never directed outwards from the mind. So kanan konala choshi, it's directed inwardly only. And then it says zinam. Zinam is a term which means it has the aspect of then perceiving a subjective quality. Subjective meaning mental quality. So there's two terms, zimba and sungwa. Sungwa means the thing which is grasped, and the grasp usually means an external object. It's an dualistic object. For instance, when you perceive something blue, blue is the perception of blue by the mind is called a form of awareness that has the aspect of perceiving a grasp object, literally. Okay? So that's an object, that's a mental state that perceives an external object. Then this self-awareness is does not have that quality. The second type of mind is the mind that has the aspect of apprehending a grasper rather than a grasp thing. A grasper means a mental state, a subjective state. So it's an introspective state of mind which is aware of subjective mental states. Yengarwa means then it's something that is then possessed simultaneously with that, for instance, that sensory awareness that perceives blue. So, what does it do? So the sensory awareness that perceives blue is not self-awareness. It perceives a grasping object. So that's called sumnam. It has the aspect of perceiving something that is grasped. But self-awareness perceives the awareness of the blue rather than the blue. Okay? So in that sense, it's perceiving your own awareness of that blueness. So that's kind of the way to understand what this particular mental entity that is postulated by the Chittamatra school, how to understand.
That is Samdhamaki Shevatikin, Mundi Shevatikin, Yuri Pechati, Radi Pechati, Shevani, Chat, Shevati, Chani, Yuri Pechati, Mundi Shevati, Radi Pechati, Ranito Pechati, Ralistia, Shevatikin, Yuri Mijita, Radi Shevati, Tapu.
Super. So this is the unique, what is a tenet of the Chittamatra school. To put it in slightly different words, but restating what was already sort of described, the Chittamatra school holds that when there is a perception, sensory perception, that cognitive event is such that two mental aspects arise simultaneously. One aspect of the mind perceives the object, in this case, blue. Another aspect of the mind perceives that sensory perception. And that second aspect is what we call self-awareness. So in order to have one's own direct awareness of one's own mind, you don't have to postulate some later state of mind that it was aware of the former state of mind. It exists at the same time that the sensory perception occurs. So this is a unique doctrine of this school.
That thing you got to see in the Gandhi's in the Pramanasiddhi, you did not be Toji, Eugene could not be the key. You did the Toji, you did the much bigger is. Very Eugene did develop the Pramanasiddhi, just and close. And close in the same time by Jerry. Koto veloci sharina, ya tito veloci sharina, nuji mishipile de verdade, nuji mishito veloci sharina. Ishania, nuji mishito veloci, tobe ya veloci sharina. Idia tito veloci sharina, tomi titi, rada resi divina, and could was which go not.
So one way to think of this in terms of kind of the, should say the context for this kind of theory is what is responsible for recollection. So when we have recollection is a mental state in which, if it's true and correct recollection, it's a recollection of something that we experience. So it's some element of our own mind which asserts to us that we had a prior experience, for example. So according to the Chitta Mantra school, unless you postulate something like this self-awareness, you would not be able to give a cogent description of how recollection occurs. So the Prasangika school, just generally to talk about the subject, they reject that whole proposition. They say, we do recall things, just from our own experience, we know we recall things, but you don't need to postulate that quality of self-awareness in order to give an explanation of recollection. So then that's a discussion that is found in works like the Bodhicharya Avatar, in the 9th chapter addresses that. Chandrakirti addresses it also. So one of the things that the Chittamantrans say is that if you don't have some element of the mind that simultaneously is present when you have a direct perception, if you claim that the way you recall something is that some other state of mind that gains awareness of a previous state of mind, then you're going to generate an infinite regress. So you're saying, well, if you need that separate state of mind in order to affirm or recall previous state of mind, then what is it that enables you to recall the recaller? So then that generates an infinite regress. So that's kind of the types of discussions that go on this topic.
That is it. That is it. That is the entire Milu's connectivity then you share with Rally, one of the Milu chatting, no some Nonayan, Tosulu chat to Milu at Tobat Maries. Just a Milu at Tobat to Japanese and Rami on Spia, just a tangular or running connectivity share creative almost is.
So then going back to this original point, this original objection, saying, "What we don't need is you don't need a treatise on epistemology because we have built into our minds elements that verify the awareness that is a valid cognition." So then this is sort of sets up for Gyetsabje the second element of what is required in order to be a complete description of what constitutes valid cognition, and that is addressing the second line of the first verse, which says that that non-deceptive mind is the meaning of being non-deceptive is that that it is it is correctly cognizing the nature, the functional nature of the object. I mean, so in order to be a valid cognition, it has to be a cognition of something that exists. If something that exists, according to this school, it's something that has the ability to then have some effect on reality. So then that's the Dengye Nuba. So here, Geshe is addressing that, is saying, so he's answering this objection by saying, the mere fact that there is such a thing as self-cognition, which directly experiences the cognizer of, for example, in this case, the color blue, that is not a complete description of what it means to be a non-deceptive awareness, meaning that self-cognition is not a complete, it doesn't contain all the essential elements of what it means to be a non-deceptive awareness, because one element of that meaning of being non-deceptive is indeed So this self-awareness does not cognize about, say, the example of the perception of blue. It does not cognize fully what is the nature of that perception of blue that constitutes its non-deceptiveness, its non-deceptive character. So then it shifts in the second line, and it says that non-deceptiveness is non-deceptiveness about the action of an object. Every entity that is real is an entity that has an effect on things. And that is Dengye Nuba. And in here it's Dengye Nuba. Dengye Nuba is this ability to carry out some purpose or some real function. That's kind of the test of a real entity. Then the complete character of a non-deceptive cognition is that in perceiving its object, it also grasps that active element of the object. So it gives an example that when shifts the example to perception of fire, for instance. So fire is a real entity that exists in the world, and the nature of fire is the character of fire, or the action of fire, is that has the ability the Sanskrit word means two things. It means to cook, and it also means to burn up, as in to incinerate. So cooking and incinerating. So heat has the ability of sort of able to modify the nature of things, as in when you cook in a chemical sense, to alter things. And then also it has another element of it. The heat is that it has the ability to incinerate. So those are the two defining active qualities of fire. So it's saying that a true valid cognition perceives that action of the object as it truly is. It says in the root text. So fire has a nature, it abides in a particular nature, which is it has a quality of burning and cooking, if you like. And so the direct perception of fire is that awareness that grasps that object fire in such a way that it correctly cognizes that action or that essential quality of fire. And self-awareness is not object oriented. It's only directed towards that inner state of mind which perceives some other object. So therefore, that self-awareness only perceives that a cognitive state has occurred, but it does not on its own have the ability to prove or to establish that that cognitive state has apprehended that essential active quality of the object. So that second line captures that more fully the meaning of what it is to be so-called non-deceptive awareness. Okay?
That is it. Then we that is Shevati with Rendi Shevati, Mele Miluati, with Tayati, Consul, Timbatari, with Yati, not, or not. That is it. So, that is just Terani, no attempt, not Amity Michigan, no attempt that any enemy looking at my yes, thank you, the
So if you look at the Tibetan, the word non-deceptive in this first verse occurs twice. In the first instance, it's used to say that valid cognition is, and then it's adjectival. It is the awareness that has the quality of being non-deceptive. That's luet jen, right? Possesses the quality of being non-deceptive. And then in the very next part of the verse, it says, never means that the quality of possessing or abiding in a state of carrying out some action. It's the recognition of that constitutes the meaning of non-deceptiveness. So that's the second occurrence of non-deceptive in the verse. So it says, milu in the second instance. So that's explaining what non-deceptiveness means when we use it to give the divine attribute of valid cognition.
That is the milu of Nursewan. That milu of Nursewan, that milu of no condition to then milu at milu as yeti, then milu at Chitas, Chimus, Chitas, Shelter, and never. It's a god. Milu as yeti, then milu as. Oh, that is a milu of Nursewan. It's subjective. So subject to the God, not that milu of Nursewan safety. Much of the church of Pramanasiddhi, not in the middle of this country. Milu at correct. One person that, and a milu as yeti.
So all of this comes under the category of identifying what it means to be non-deceptive. So we start out by saying valid cognition is a non-deceptive awareness. But what does non-deceptive mean? Non-deceptiveness means to apprehend something about the object, its object. And mainly it is the action which that object is able to carry out. So in the case of fire, it is the capacity to burn and incinerate. That's the active quality of fire, and the direct perception of fire perceives that about its object in a correct way, in a non-deceptive way. fire actually has that characteristic, and the correct cognition of fire directly will grasp that element of that object. And that's why we call it a non-deceptive cognition. So then now we're going to the second topic, which is to say that that definition is not, it doesn't cover all instances of what we want to say is valid cognition. In other words, there are other kinds of awareness that don't fit those qualities, and therefore it's not complete in its scope. It covers certain kinds of cognition, but it ignores others. So it gives, for an example, it says, this notion of being non-deceptive about the action of its object. So what that means is, and then here uses a phrase, which is kind of an interesting phrase, yultobe. Yultoba literally means to attain the object. Probably the sense word prop means sort of to comprehend, I think, to comprehend something about the object. Maybe it's tentatively, it's my best guess as how to translate. So only certain kinds of correct cognition have that aspect of having some kind of cognitive comprehension of an object. And then it says, what about sound? And here this is a kind of something that might not normally think of. So the idea is that sound is something that is something that occurs that seems to have some sort of extension to it, but actually the essence of the sound is something that's only instantaneous. So each moment of the sound, real sound, is something that is momentary, right? So if you take the sound of a cymbal clapping, for instance, the initial time that event occurs, there's a loud sound that's clapping the cymbals, but then that sound, once it's been generated, it sort of, diminishes. It's kind of an echo of that process. So it's saying that the actual sound is only occurring moment to moment. It's like lightning. Lightning is something that is instantaneous. You see it for an instant and then it's gone. So sound is the same way like that. So there's nothing about the nature of sound, this is I believe what the text is. Nothing about the nature of sound, which allows you to have some kind of cognitive comprehension of that object, sound, because it's so momentary. That's all. Sure, that's it. So So then in the case of sound, what the text is saying is there's nothing that you, when I said comprehend cognitively, then that I use that expression to describe something, to acquire something about the object. So that notion of being a non-deceptive awareness, in the sense that you recognize or you grasp what its action is, and that is something that is in a way obtaining something, some kind of knowledge about the object. There's no such thing that you obtain in relation to raw sound, for example. Nevertheless, it says then we can say something about sound, sound being then we have a hearing consciousness, where we have a hearing awareness. So the consciousness of hearing that arises in relation to grasping sounds, right? That's the nature of hearing. Then that can also be a form of valid cognition. we're talking about how you have valid cognition in relation to auditory cognition. So what does that consist of? He says that also can be identified as a form of valid cognition. It's not your claim that this definition doesn't apply to sound is not correct. Gyumed means that error does not apply because rangi shelta means then the thing that's being cognized by hearing consciousness is something that is the intent of the mind. So the mind has the intent to hear something, and then because of that intent, then you listen to the sound, and then that sound here, as it says, it is able to reveal something to you newly. So that revealing of something, right, or making known of something. This is still part of verse 1. It says, that which arises in relation to sound, right? Yang, right? Yang means that which arises in relation to sound. That too is a form of valid cognition, despite what the objection is suggesting, because sound has the ability to reveal. Jampa means reveal what is some desired object. Shelta means object to cognize. Shelta means an object that we desire to have knowledge of. Then that sound becomes the vehicle that enables that meaning to be revealed to your mind newly. So I believe what it's saying is it's saying that we can realize the import of words, for instance, which is through hearing, even though the import of words do not directly correspond to some actual object in the world. They are, mental import, some meaning in the mind. But that too can be can have a certain kind of valid cognition in relation to those things which are not necessarily things that are actively producing some kind of effect on the world. So this is a kind of special, not an exception, but sort of a Buddhist view on the nature of how words can be understood as also having some epistemological validity.
어디 어디 시대 중심만세야지.
the tradition the Yandesh Shabbat.
지난 당부들의 저중심만세야지. 이게 가수들이 저 저한테 제니 또 정말 지대에서 다 저중심만세야지야. 랑기 자기 랑기 주제는 아니 또데 공부도 아니 참말이 또 주제 되는 것도 참말이 말이지. 근데 자기 자기 주제 되는 것도 자기의 주제 되는 게 최고야. 자기 예스다리나 예외는 봐야 말이. 되게 매도 쓰면 이게 예외는 봐야 말이. 모두 미래 투프레스 모두 미래 야레스 모두 그만 투프레스 제바탐기 모두 그만 소리 봐야 말이. 사실 이제 자기 당 제제 등이 좋아야 말이.
Jadam and during
너는 메타버시티를 일단 메타버니는 좋아야 말이. 그 메타버탄의 마음이 지금 메타버시를 준비해 봐. 이 되게 메타버야 말이. 그렇죠. 메타버 고투야 말이. 그 메타버하고 그냥 말이. 아 메타버스에 지금 지금 내가 되는 메타버 지금 메타버 주제 제일 중요한 거. 그래서 매일이나 매일에 좋아야 한다. 감각이나 매일에 제외나 이게 매일 주제 중요한 거. 내가 지금 좋아야 한다. 지금 내가 되는 게 투구야 말봐. 그게 매일에 있는 지금 되는 그날 내 투구 말봐. 내가 어디 말봐. 내가 말봐.
perfect.
다시는 주직이는 좋아야 말이죠. 이내야 주직이다. 죄는 꾸는이부터 좋아야 되죠. 주직이 다 꾸는지 이게 다 주직이랑 꾸는도 돼. 아니 누가야 주제 되는 거에 누가야 주직이 다 있는다. 주직 꾸는지 보여봐. 어디 예산 같은데지 주직이 꾸는도 돼. 아니 저쪽 참만의 제외나 주직이 다이 꾸는도 돼. 아니 참만 지어봐. 꾸는도 돼. 참만이 주직이 다이 꾸는도 돼. 참만이 저쪽 참만 제외나 그렇지 참만이 꾸는도 돼. 참만이 아니 주제 되는 법에 참만 말이. 주직이 따라 주직이는 좋아해. 좋아하는 주직이 다 있는 주제 기록이야. 내가 예산
특히 일제 마을 생겨서 그런 게 대만인 것으로
다들 무슨 말하는지 다 내 열애 시기를 다들 내 열애 내가 말다. 다들 나를 세리유스는 세리유는 거야. 다들 나를 유대유스는 유대유는 거야. 다들 다들은 주제들을 더 해서야 돼.
So then the next verse, which is second verse, can be also understood as in relation to this. What in the first verse was saying that sound also has the quality of the perception of sound has the quality of being valid cognition, even though the perception of sound is not something that enables you to literally obtain something about an object. So I believe what the idea also is saying that when we're talking about cognition, one of the main purposes of this is saying that the value of valid cognition is that it allows us to successfully attain the goals that we seek. And that's kind of its real purpose and its value. So then hearing sounds does not on its own do anything by itself to enable us to achieve some kind of goal. So that's however, then the verse saying that it elucidates something. So there was that first interpretation saying that you're hearing sound in just the sense of general sound. But then the second verse here kind of takes that discussion about sound in a slightly different direction. And so that's set up here in Jesuit's text, where he's saying, well, he said, this again, a hypothetical person who might question. So the first part of this text is meant to set up, give the definition of what valid cognition is, so that we can then explain how the Buddha is the epitome of the one who possesses that kind of valid cognition. So then here, the hypothetical objection to that, or counter-argument to that, is we don't need to know that Buddha is an ultimate spiritual authority. It's enough that if we gain a valid cognition about the way that treatises, now we're going to written compositions and verbal, the sound that comes from intelligent persons, right? Speech, that kind of speech in a written form, for example, can give us access to valid cognition about everything that we need to know. And so is that not sufficient? Are treatises themselves not sufficient to allow us to achieve whatever our desired aims might be, right? So are books more important than people, you might put it, if you want to put it simply. Then saying, so therefore, why do we need to prove that the Buddha is an ultimate spiritual authority? It's enough that we have, treatises that explain to us what valid cognition is. So the answer to that is, said that treatises, written works, make some kind of assertions about things. So treatises, the use of the word jie and jia, which is the active participle of expressing, and the future participle of expression. So he's saying that which expresses. So that which expresses is the words that are in the treatise. And that which is being expressed is the subject matter or the import of what those words are saying. So what it says here is the expressive quality of the words, what the words are saying in a treatise, are no guarantee that what the import of those words are is true. So you can't say that even though they give us some kind of understanding about what the temporary and ultimate goals are, they do not serve what those treatises say in their words, do not serve as a valid then something to rely upon to know for certain that what they're saying about those goals is actually true. There's no, words do not inherently have a connection between their import and what the words are saying. Or the meaning, the object, and the words themselves, there's no logical connection between it that proves that what they're talking about is necessarily true. Therefore, the only thing that words have the ability to tell us in a certain way is they can reveal to us what the intent of the speaker is to express. What he or she thinks may be true doesn't mean it's true. So we can read words that someone wrote, and then we can from that infer what that person thought, what that person believed. That's the extent of the valid cognition that we can gain in relation to words of a treatise, for instance. Like that. So, as Rinpoche said, if someone says there is gold in that house, or there is a fire in that house, that's no guarantee that those words are true. There's nothing about the words themselves that will reliably convey to us the existence of fire or gold in the place or locus where they say it. If we want to know that that's true or not, we have to do something besides accept those words. So the only thing that those words do is they inform us what the person who spoke them thinks.
Yeah, that is.
So that's So for instance, if someone says, then all causally produced things are impermanent. So those words have some meaning to them. But it may be the case that the person who expresses those words has not actually realized that meaning, right? So the mere fact that he or she expresses those words does not establish the fact that things are impermanent. They are impermanent, but saying they're impermanent doesn't make it so, right? And it doesn't even mean that that person has realized impermanence. The only thing it tells us is he believes, or he has that thought in his mind that things are impermanent. The fact that he says them, that's the only thing that those words can infallibly convey to us, is what's in the mind of the speaker who utters them. So this is really about the subject of testimony, which is to say, when people say things, how reliable is the things that they say? Do we have any basis for, in fact, accepting what the person is saying? That's the topic of testimony. And in Buddhism has a very strict, very limited idea about the nature of testimony. So in the case of Buddhism, the only thing that we can validly infer about words that people express is what is in the mind of the person who expresses it. Buddhists would say there's absolutely no logical connection between the words themselves and the reality in the world itself. So we can have a valid cognition in relation to someone's speech, but it's limited to what the speaker believes or thinks or has in mind his motivation, her motivation. But we cannot infer the truthfulness of his or her words, with one exception. That's to come later.
Yeah, that is the that is Khensur. That and Milua, Satu Milua, Milua, Lele Milua, Setuna, Lele Milua, Seti, Kati, Chitemba, Nashi, Relene, never Tosuna, Negituna, Lele Milua. Today, Lele Milua, somebody Chitar, Shabati, Chitar, Tobanashi, Relene, Negito, Taje, the Negitun, Shabati, Milua. Sanjay Jumde did Sanjay Jumde did Khensur and it Taje Jenny, the name to the Tadi, Sanjay did, Miluarba, the someone to need it at the Java. Sanjay Jumban, she Taje Jay, never have a Sanjay. Anyway, somebody was how those would come out how we are not. Was she let in it? Give it to us and let it almost. Share it to us and let us. Whatever it could be a lot of that music. Give it to us and it can't be.
So, to sum up, since we're coming to the end of the morning class, then first verse is beginning. First two verses are talking about how Buddhists generally should understand the nature of valid cognition. So the key word is the idea of being non-deceptive. And so being non-deceptive is interpreted as meaning the ability to correctly apprehend the action that a real object performs. And awareness of that is what is meant by the non-deceptive awareness as main defining quality of valid cognition. So then the question of sound, the question of speech is addressed secondarily, and it's acknowledged by the Buddhist epistemologists that speech can serve in some capacity as a source of valid cognition, but for ordinary people, it's limited to giving us knowledge about the nature of what the speaker believes and nothing more. There's no connection between the ordinary person's speech and reality. We cannot infer anything about reality from the ordinary person. However, the nature of the Buddha is that he is then I use the word authority for the word pramana, right? Meaning in the sense that he possesses valid cognition in the sense of complete and total valid cognition about the nature of the temporary and ultimate goals, as well as the means, meaning the paths, meaning the practices that will enable us to achieve those goals. So therefore, we can, if we investigate the nature of Buddhahood in the sense of the possibility of it being attainable in the first instance, and what are the necessary qualities and conditions that would allow someone to become enlightened, and then when we examine the Buddha's teaching and we can determine for ourselves their extraordinary nature, then we can make the inference that the Buddha is, and to use the Tibetan word, seme kibu, means the person who is a valid source of spiritual knowledge, in the sense that everything which he says about those subject matters can be relied upon. And so that's the one exception to that notion about testimony.
Sanjay Sumbatil Tate Jenny, or Tatis Sanjay Tamarisha, Uspa, it took the Jamba Jamba Chemi Chamai Botoni, and Jamba Chamai Yati, to Dalati, you wrote it Chamai, but I to Jamba, Loti Jayas, Yati. Don't need to know the daddy. Don't need to know that, but it's a main house. Then I see Sanjay, and then want to get the Jabala, Samai, but the care in Bala, you haven't want to need it, touch the Jabala. Because Chama, when it's Chama, you come to the Timon Asia. Sanjay is the Tagara, the Shas and Sanjay, it's another chapter. The Yichi come to
Chamara,
Chamara,
you talk
it could talk about. He is a Jamba Chama to me, Jamba Chama Yaji, he made the jet. Jamba Cham give me the Tony. Jamba Chama Jimmy to where they put the down to get it. That's not lots of dancing. But in Christianity, Jamba
So if we take it back to the discussions that were covered yesterday, we were talking about the two presentations of those four epithets that are asserted about Buddha as being, the elements that support his being asserted that he is a spiritual authority. So there were two. One was, the first one was saying that we can establish the validity of the Buddha as being an enlightened being, and therefore his teaching can be, recognized as being valid. Then in the reverse order, it was saying that the person with sharper faculty, then they can examine the Buddha's testimony, not take it on just on faith, but to study it, to learn it, and to ideally verify for ourselves, gain correct inference, gain correct direct perception of what the Buddha's taught. And in that way, prove to ourselves, to our own knowledge, that what the Buddha said is true. And so therefore we can establish that the teaching is valid. And when we can establish the validity of the teaching, then we can infer, therefore, the Buddha who taught it, because of the uniqueness of the teaching, then he was a unique spiritual authority. So that's working from the teaching to gain a certainty of the Buddha as a valid spiritual authority. So that's kind of the aim, or that's kind of what's being set out as the value of the subject matter in this treatise, in this chapter of this treatise particularly. Then, so in more practical terms, it's not easy for us as ordinary practitioners to gain true valid cognition about the Four Noble Truths, for example. But we still have the ability to learn about them, to gain some clear understanding of them, even if it doesn't rise to the level of valid cognition. Then there is a form of, so in Buddhist epistemology, there are 7 kinds of cognitive states. 2 of them are valid cognition. 5 of them are not valid cognitions, but they're cognitively relevant. So we already discussed one, was that recognition, which is the correct cognition, but it's not the initial or original. And another one is yichir. Yichir means belief. It's a kind of belief. So a belief is a cognitive state of mind, but it's not justified. We have not verified it for ourselves to be true. It may very well be true, or in some cases it may be false belief. But if we are devout Buddhists, and we are inclined to believe what the Buddha taught, and we to develop a form of somewhat informed belief about the Buddha's doctrine, then that goes, some way towards that process by which we can establish for ourselves that the Buddha's teaching has this unique truthfulness to it, and therefore we become more justified in placing our trust in the Buddha as ultimate spiritual authority. So that's kind of practical, in a practical sense.
다음 이제 공들기 전에 동바체만 또 아니네 동바체미 그또 시야지 누가 이제 전에다 모두게 동바체 재미기분이 뭐 이지 전에 되는지 동바를 주기하라 이지 전에 주기하라 또나 대체만 가야 유대 가르를 때는 또 공들기 동바체만 이거지 또네 되네 동바 재미기분이 이거지 Jampa Gyumed Tuari Chevra. The only Vinata, only the Jampa Semiki Gyumed Tambuto. The net Temple Jubainati, those in the deep with their career territory. So, not the Egypt river. Not Jampa did, Jampa Semiki is. Gyumed is the Egypt journey. The Temple Jubilee, not each generation. Tomba Semiki, but the Toyamava. Not Tony. The Rinpoche told me, the bad current good. They are the Munerisha, everywhere. Not just only with that, you can't. Kabbalah, Temekibli, the Yichi Jenny, Deme by Yichi Jenny, to let you get on around the festival. No. Thank you. Yichi Jenny. I think I'm going to use the Chiva. You can let it do the target and get on, give me the gun. Chosen on America. Honest.
So, by the same token, so in a broader sense, what this whole chapter is about is giving us the justification for applying ourselves to the paths that will bring us to the goals, temporary goals, and ultimate goals. We have to have, so ideally, we have to have a reason to take these particular teachings about the paths and the goals as the ones that we want to adopt. So the previous example was that the reverse order of those, the presentation of those four epithets was kind of the methodology to be adopted by Christian Sharp faculty, who, to greater or lesser degree, verifies through experience and reflection the truthfulness of the teaching, and then derives faith in the Buddha as the one who's the source of that teaching. So the first presentation of those four in the original order of their occurrence was described by the one scholar from Trustee Rinpoche saying that person of weaker faculties methodology is to establish the validity of the teacher, and based on that, and infer whether his teaching must be true. Okay. So, if you're honest, then this is not a criticism or some kind of dismissal of our spiritual aspirations. But most of us really don't have the ability to verify how the Buddha, in fact, initially is a true spiritual authority, which would be the basis for us to therefore infer that his teaching is a valid teaching, right? Which is presumed purpose or aim of that initial presentation. So what is how can we want to say, well, what is the status that most of us possess is we, for varying reasons, view the Buddha with some kind of reverence as an extraordinary being who achieved enlightenment, but that idea is something that's based mostly on belief, not verified. We have not verified it. So it's a form of unjustified faith kind of belief. And we use that belief then to say, well, therefore, what he taught must be valid, must be worthwhile. We don't even necessarily validate that. We then simply apply ourselves to whatever we have been taught. One form of practitioner is called a practitioner who relies on faith. He or she is not able to verify the truthfulness of what they're being taught. They accept it on faith. And it's a valid way of developing yourself spiritually, but it's based on faith more than it is on knowledge. So these are important kind of discussions about the nature of spirituality. So there's this account, which is it's not a joke. It's something that was said to actually have occurred, so this is something that is said to have actually occurred, and it involves a Mongolian. Because a lot of Mongolians came to Tibet to study Tibetan Buddhism in monasteries. And so this was one such person. And he went to Sakyapandita. Sakyapandita was like 1200s or something like that. Great master. And so he is reported to have said, well, we're not supposed to just willy-nilly find a teacher and, say, I want you to be my teacher. You're supposed to spend some time, investigating whether this is the real teacher and whether you have, good connection with that person. And so, therefore, you're willing to approach the person and ask to be accepted as a student. So he said, he took 12 years. He said, but this is kind of the classic saying is that you can examine your teacher for 12 years before you're able to really decide in a proper way that this is the teacher for you. So he said he did that, and then he was satisfied. So he goes to Sakyapandita and says, I want to be your student. So Sakyapandita says to him, oh, okay, well, it's also my responsibility to examine you to see whether you're a suitable disciple. So he said, I'll take 12 years to do that. So point of the story is 24 years go by with this examining that went on, and so the opportunity to actually practice can sometimes suffer. So there's the ideal, and then there's the practical, and then there's what we what we need to do to further ourselves spiritually. So the ideal is that we should all have the intellect and the ability to fathom the Buddha's teaching and learn it for ourselves and then apply ourselves. But if we make that sort of a precondition for engaging in any kind of spiritual pursuit, we may be left holding the bag.
Yeah, yeah.
So we'll leave it there today.